My son said I was confused, so he would handle everything from now on. The sentence landed softly, almost gently, across the polished wood of my dining table, as if it were a kindness instead of a verdict, and for a moment I simply looked at him, at Michael, the boy I had raised, the man now sitting across from me in a tailored navy sweater that probably cost more than my monthly grocery bill. And I noticed something I hadn't seen before, not in all his 42 years, not in scraped knees or graduation speeches, or the day he buried his father. There was no hesitation in his eyes, no softness, only a calm certainty that made the room feel smaller, quieter, like something had already been decided long before I was invited to sit at that table. And beside him, Sophia folded her hands neatly in her lap, her posture perfect, her smile polite, but her eyes never quite met mine. They flickered instead toward Michael, as if waiting for him to finish what they had already discussed in private. And I realized then that this wasn't a conversation, it was an announcement, a transfer, a quiet reshuffling of power dressed up as concern. It's just until things settle, he added, his voice careful, practiced, the same tone he used when explaining contracts to clients, slow and reasonable, as if the words themselves could smooth over the weight of what he was taking. You've been forgetting things lately, Mom. The bills, the appointments. I don't want you to have to worry about it anymore. And I nodded, because that was what he expected, because that was what made this easier for him, for both of them, and because I could feel something shifting beneath the surface of the moment, something colder than confusion, something sharper than forgetfulness, and I didn't trust myself to speak just yet. So I reached for my glass of water instead, my hand steady, my movements deliberate, and I took a sip as if I were considering his offer, as if I were weighing options that no longer belonged to me, and the house felt different, even then, as if it were already slipping out of my hands, the familiar ticking of the clock on the wall sounding louder than it had that morning, the same clock Harold had fixed 3 times before he passed, insisting it just needed patience, not replacement. And I wondered, briefly, what he would have said if he had been sitting where I was, whether Michael would have spoken so confidently, whether Sophia would have smiled so politely. But that thought passed quickly, because Harold was gone, and this was what remained, this quiet, careful takeover wrapped in concern. We can start with the accounts, Michael continued, already reaching into his leather folder, already pulling out papers I hadn't known existed, just to simplify things, he said, sliding them toward me. And I noticed how easily the pen appeared in his hand, how naturally it rested between his fingers before he placed it in front of me, like a small, ordinary object, harmless, necessary, expected, and I looked down at the documents without reading them. Not yet, not fully, just enough to see my name printed at the top, just enough to understand that something was being moved, transferred, reorganized, and I let the silence stretch between us, long enough for Michael to shift slightly in his chair, long enough for Sophia to glance at him again, and then I smiled. A small, quiet smile that didn't quite reach my eyes, and I picked up the pen, holding it lightly, as if it weighed nothing at all. If you think it's best, I said, my voice calm, steady, the way it had always been when I was the one making decisions, and Michael relaxed instantly, his shoulders easing, his breath leaving him in a way that told me he had been waiting for this moment, waiting for my agreement more than anything else. And Sophia's smile widened just slightly, just enough to reveal satisfaction before she looked away, and I signed where he pointed, one page after another, my signature neat, consistent, unchanged, even as everything else shifted around it. And when I finished, I set the pen down carefully, aligning it with the edge of the paper, the way I had always done, the way I had taught Michael when he was a boy learning how to write his name for the first time. And I folded my hands in my lap, looking at him across the table, really looking this time, at the confidence in his posture, at the quiet approval in Sophia's expression, and I understood something then, something clear and sharp and undeniable. I wasn't confused, not even a little, but I let them believe I was, because sometimes the easiest way to see the truth is to let people think you've already missed it. The next morning felt quieter than it should have, not peaceful, not calm, but hollow in a way I could not quite name, as if something essential had been removed overnight and the house itself had not yet realized it was gone. And I moved through my kitchen slowly, deliberately, the same way I had for years, reaching for the coffee tin on the second shelf, measuring 2 level scoops into the machine, pressing the same worn button I had pressed every morning since Harold bought it on sale at a hardware store 15 years ago. And yet even that small routine felt different, like I was performing a memory rather than living in my own life. And when I opened the drawer to take out my checkbook, my hand paused for just a fraction of a second because it was not there. The space where it had always been sat empty except for a folded receipt and a pen I did not recognize. And I stood there longer than necessary, not confused, not searching, just observing the absence, letting it settle into place. And then I closed the drawer without a word, because I already knew where it had gone, or more precisely, who had taken responsibility for it. And I turned back to my coffee as if nothing had changed, even though everything had. And later that afternoon, when the mail arrived, I noticed another difference, subtle, almost polite in the way it presented itself. The envelopes that usually came addressed to me were fewer, replaced by statements and notices bearing Michael's name beneath mine, or sometimes instead of it. And I ran my fingers lightly over the printed letters, tracing the shift in ownership that no one had announced out loud. And I set them neatly on the counter without opening them, because I did not need to read them to understand what they meant. And when Michael came home that evening, he moved through the house with a quiet confidence that had not been there before, his footsteps steady, purposeful, as if he were no longer visiting but managing. And he greeted me warmly enough, asking about my day, about whether I had eaten, but there was a new rhythm to his questions, a subtle distance, like a checklist rather than a conversation. And Sophia followed behind him, setting her bag down carefully, her eyes scanning the room for a moment before landing on me, offering the same polite smile she had perfected. "We stopped by the bank today," Michael said casually, loosening his watch as he spoke, "just to make sure everything is organized properly." And I nodded, because that was what I did now. I nodded, I listened, I allowed the words to pass through the space between us without resistance. And I noticed how he did not ask for my input, how he did not pause to see if I had questions, because in his mind, the questions had already been answered, the decisions already made. And I realized then that control does not arrive loudly. It settles in quietly, piece by piece, until one day it is simply there, unquestioned. And later, when I went to log into my email to check a confirmation for a doctor's appointment, the password I had used for years did not work. Not once, not twice, not even when I slowed down and typed each letter carefully. And the message on the screen remained the same: incorrect password, try again. And I stared at it for a moment, not in frustration, not in panic, but in recognition, because this was not an accident. This was part of the same careful pattern, the same gentle removal of access. And I closed the laptop without attempting to reset it, without calling for help, because I wanted to see how far this would go, how much they believed I would not notice. And that night, as I sat in the living room with the lamp casting a soft yellow light over the armchair Harold used to sit in, I listened to the quiet murmur of Michael and Sophia talking in the kitchen, their voices low, their words indistinct, but their tone unmistakable, controlled, coordinated. And I rested my hands in my lap, feeling the steady rhythm of my own breathing, grounding myself in the only thing that had not been taken. And I thought about the papers I had signed, about the pen I had placed back so carefully, about the way Michael had relaxed the moment I agreed. And I understood that what they saw as confusion was, in fact, silence, and what they believed was weakness was, in truth, patience. And I let that realization settle over me like a quiet certainty, because I had spent a lifetime learning when to speak and when to wait. And this was not the moment to interrupt them. This was the moment to watch, to listen, to let the small changes reveal the larger truth. And as I turned off the lamp and the room fell into darkness, I allowed myself one small, private thought, clear and steady. I had not lost control. I had simply stepped back long enough to see who was reaching for it. I began to notice the pattern not in what was taken, but in what was no longer offered, the quiet absence of things that once moved naturally through my days, like conversation, like inclusion, like the simple courtesy of being asked. And it showed itself in small ways at first, so small that anyone else might have dismissed them as coincidence. But I had lived too long, seen too many seasons of people revealing themselves, to believe in coincidence when the details aligned so precisely. And it started with breakfast 3 days later when Michael sat across from me scrolling through his phone, his coffee untouched, his expression focused in that distant way he used when he was working through numbers in his head, and I watched him for a moment before speaking, not because I needed permission, but because I wanted to observe how he would respond. "Did the utility bill come in this week?" I asked, my voice light, almost casual, and he did not look up right away. He finished whatever he was reading first, then set the phone down slowly as if shifting roles from one responsibility to another. "It is all handled," he said, and the way he said it, calm, efficient, final, told me more than the words themselves, because there was no follow-up, no explanation, no amount mentioned, no timeline, just a closed door where there used to be an open one, and I nodded again, because that was what I did now. I allowed the door to remain closed, and later that afternoon I found another change. One that had not been announced at all. My bedroom closet, the one Harold had built shelves into by hand on a long summer weekend, had been rearranged, not drastically, not enough to draw immediate attention, but enough that the balance of it fell off. My documents, the small box where I kept personal papers, insurance cards, copies of old agreements, had been moved from the upper shelf to somewhere I could not immediately see, and I stood there with the door open, letting my eyes adjust, letting the silence settle, and then I closed it again without searching further, because I already understood that the point was not to hide things completely. The point was to remind me, gently but clearly, that access no longer belonged to me in the way it once had. And that evening Sophia joined me in the living room, sitting across from me with her hands folded neatly, the same composed posture she always carried, and she asked me how I was feeling, her tone soft, concerned in the way people speak when they are already certain of the answer. And I looked at her for a moment, really looked, at the careful way she held her expression, at the slight tilt of her head that suggested patience rather than curiosity, and I realized that she was not asking to understand. She was asking to confirm, to measure whether I was staying within the version of me they had already decided on. "I feel fine," I said, and her smile remained, but something behind it shifted, just slightly, as if the answer had not quite aligned with what she expected, and she nodded anyway, accepting it without question, because it did not matter what I said as long as I behaved. And that was when I began to see her more clearly, not as someone standing beside my son, but as someone positioned just behind him, guiding, adjusting, shaping the direction without ever stepping fully into view. And over the next few days the pattern continued. My phone no longer displayed certain notifications. Calls that once came directly to me now passed through Michael first. And when I asked about a letter I had been expecting from my insurance provider, he assured me it had already been taken care of. The same phrase repeated with the same calm certainty, as if repetition alone could make it unquestionable. And I listened, and I watched, and I allowed each piece to fall into place without interrupting the picture they were building, because the more complete it became, the clearer it was to me. And one evening, as I passed by the kitchen, I heard Sophia's voice, low but distinct enough for me to catch a single sentence. "She will not even notice if we adjust the transfer schedule." And there was a pause, followed by Michael's voice, quieter, less certain. "Are you sure?" And her response came quickly, smooth, confident. "She already signed everything." And I did not stop walking. I did not make a sound. I simply continued down the hallway at the same steady pace, because that one sentence told me everything I needed to know, not just about what they were doing, but about what they believed. And belief is often more revealing than action. And as I returned to my room, closing the door softly behind me, I sat at the edge of the bed and folded my hands together, feeling the calm settle over me again. Not confusion, not fear, but clarity. Because now I could see the structure of it, the careful layering of control, the quiet confidence built on the assumption that I was no longer capable of understanding it. And I let that assumption remain exactly where it was, untouched. Because sometimes the strongest position is the one no one thinks to question, and I had no intention of correcting them just yet. It was not the present that unsettled me the most. It was the way it echoed against the past, the quiet comparison that formed without effort, without invitation, as I moved through rooms that still held the shape of a life that had once been mine in full. And I found myself pausing more often, not because I was lost, but because memory has a way of standing beside you when everything else begins to shift. And that morning I stopped in the hallway outside the study, the door slightly open, the faint scent of old paper and polished wood drifting out the way it always had. And for a moment I saw it as it used to be, Harold sitting at his desk with his reading glasses low on his nose, a legal pad in front of him, his handwriting steady and deliberate, the kind of man who never rushed a decision because he understood that the weight of it would remain long after the moment passed. And I remembered how he used to call me in, not because he needed permission, but because he believed I deserved to know, to understand, to be part of whatever affected our lives. "Eleanor, come take a look at this," he would say, and I would stand beside him, leaning slightly over his shoulder as he explained things in a voice that was calm and patient, never assuming I would not understand, never reducing me to something fragile or incapable. And I realized then how different that felt from the quiet efficiency Michael had adopted. The way decisions now moved around me instead of through me. The way explanations had been replaced with assurances, and I stepped into the study slowly, my hand brushing lightly against the back of Harold's chair, grounding myself in something that had once been certain, and I opened the top drawer of the desk, expecting nothing in particular, just the familiar order Harold had always kept. And most of it remained unchanged, neatly stacked papers, a few old receipts, a fountain pen he had insisted on refilling himself. But beneath those, tucked slightly out of sight, was a folder I did not recognize, heavier than the others, its edges crisp as if it had not been handled often, and I did not open it right away. I simply held it for a moment, feeling its weight, considering what it represented, because Harold had never been careless with documents, never left things without purpose. And when I finally opened it, the papers inside were not recent, they were dated months before his passing, written in that same careful handwriting, supplemented by typed pages bearing official headers, and I read slowly, not because I could not keep up, but because I wanted to understand every word, every clause, every intention behind what he had prepared. And as the meaning unfolded, clear and precise, I felt something settle into place inside me, something steady, something certain, because Harold had anticipated more than I realized. He had considered the possibility that I might one day be treated as less than I was, that decisions might be taken from me under the guise of protection, and he had written safeguards, conditions that required my explicit confirmation for certain transfers, provisions that ensured oversight beyond a single signature. And I sat down in his chair, the leather cool beneath my hands, and I read the documents again, this time more slowly, letting the implications align with everything I had observed over the past days. The missing checkbook, the altered access, the quiet conversations that assumed I would not notice. And I understood then that what Michael believed to be complete control was, in fact, incomplete, built on the assumption that one signature was enough to dissolve everything that came before it. And I closed the folder carefully, returning the papers to their place exactly as I had found them, because this was not something to reveal yet. This was something to hold, to understand fully before it was brought into the light. And as I stood to leave the study, I paused once more, looking around the room not with nostalgia, but with clarity, because Harold had not only left me memories, he had left me a structure, a quiet protection that did not announce itself, that did not interfere until it was needed. And as I turned off the light and closed the door behind me, I felt the weight of the past settle into the present in a way that no longer felt like loss, but like preparation, because now I knew something they did not, something they had not accounted for, and I intended to let them continue exactly as they were, believing that everything had already been decided, because sometimes the most powerful position is the one you hold without anyone else realizing it exists. By the end of that week, I no longer needed to wonder how far they intended to go, because the answer began to reveal itself not through confrontation, but through confidence, the kind that grows when people believe they are no longer being watched. And it showed itself on a quiet Thursday afternoon when Michael suggested we sit down together again, this time not at the dining table, but in the living room, where the atmosphere felt softer, more informal, as if the change in setting might make the conversation seem less significant than it truly was. And Sophia sat beside him, her posture composed as always, a tablet resting lightly in her hands, her fingers poised as if ready to confirm something the moment it was spoken. And I took my seat across from them, folding my hands in my lap, the same calm expression I had worn every day since that first conversation. And Michael cleared his throat slightly before speaking. There are just a few adjustments we need to make, he said, his tone careful but assured, and I noticed how he did not look directly at me at first, his eyes flickering briefly towards Sophia, who gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, and then he continued. Nothing major, just streamlining things so everything is easier to manage going forward. And I inclined my head slightly, signaling that I was listening, allowing him to proceed. Without interruption, and Sophia turned the tablet toward me, the screen displaying a series of accounts, numbers arranged neatly in columns, percentages highlighted in soft blue, all presented in a way that appeared organized, efficient, professional, and yet there was something about the structure of it that felt off, not incorrect, but intentional in a way that suggested redirection rather than simplification. And I let my eyes move across the screen slowly, not lingering too long on any one detail, because I did not want them to see recognition where they expected uncertainty, and Michael pointed to a section near the bottom. We are consolidating a few of the accounts into one primary fund, he explained. It will make things easier to track and manage, and I nodded again, because that was the role I had chosen to play, the one they believed in, the one that allowed them to continue without resistance. And Sophia spoke then, her voice smooth, measured. It is really for your benefit, Eleanor, so you do not have to worry about multiple accounts or keeping track of everything. And I met her gaze for a moment, just long enough to see the confidence there, the quiet certainty that I would accept whatever was placed in front of me. And I offered a small smile in return, one that revealed nothing, one that invited them to continue exactly as they intended. And Michael slid another set of documents across the table, the pages crisp, the lines already marked where my signature would be required, and I picked them up carefully, holding them just long enough to give the appearance of consideration, even though I already understood the pattern, the gradual shifting of assets, the repositioning of control under a structure that appeared legitimate on the surface. And I reached for the pen once more, my hand steady, my expression unchanged, and I signed where he indicated, each stroke deliberate, each letter clear, because there was no advantage in hesitation, no benefit in resistance at this stage. And when I finished, I set the pen down exactly as I had before, aligning it neatly with the edge of the paper, and Michael exhaled softly, a subtle release of tension that told me this moment had mattered more to him than he intended to show. And Sophia tapped something on the tablet, her fingers moving quickly, efficiently, confirming the changes as if completing a transaction that had already been decided long before this conversation took place. And for a moment, the room fell quiet, the kind of quiet that follows completion, and Michael leaned back slightly, his posture relaxed, his expression satisfied in a way that was almost boyish, almost familiar, and yet entirely different from the child I had once known, and I watched him carefully, taking in the ease with which he believed everything was now under his control, the absence of doubt in his eyes, and I realized that confidence, when built on incomplete understanding, has a particular kind of fragility, one that does not reveal itself until the moment it is tested. And I rose from my seat slowly, smoothing my hands over my skirt in a gesture that was more habit than necessity, and I thanked them, quietly, sincerely enough to maintain the illusion. And I walked out of the room at the same measured pace I had maintained all week, because nothing about this required urgency. Nothing about this required reaction. And as I moved down the hallway, I allowed myself one brief glance toward the study door, still closed, still holding the knowledge they had not yet discovered. And I understood that what they saw as progress was, in fact, exposure. Each step they took revealing more than they realized, each decision adding another piece to a picture they could not yet see. And I returned to my room, closing the door softly behind me, and I sat at the edge of the bed, my hands resting calmly in my lap, my breathing steady, because now the pattern was complete, the intention unmistakable, and all that remained was timing, not whether I would act, but when. The following morning, I changed nothing, not my routine, not my pace, not even the way I folded my napkin after breakfast, because consistency is what makes observation possible, and I wanted them to feel secure in the version of me they had already accepted, the version that signed without question and nodded without resistance. And Michael left early for work that day, his steps quick, his mind already elsewhere, while Sophia lingered just a little longer in the kitchen, organizing things that did not need organizing. adjusting objects that had already been aligned, and I watched her quietly from my seat, not directly, but through the reflection in the glass cabinet across from me, because reflections have a way of revealing what direct attention can sometimes hide, and I noticed the way she checked her phone twice within a minute, the way her eyes moved quickly across the screen before she slipped it back into her pocket, and then she turned toward me with that same composed expression. "Do you need anything today?" she asked, her voice gentle, measured. And I shook my head lightly, offering a small smile. "No, I think I will just rest," I said, and she nodded, satisfied, because rest was what fit into their understanding of me now. Rest implied passivity, and passivity required no supervision. And when she left the room, I remained seated for a moment longer, counting the seconds in my head, not out of habit, but out of intention, waiting until the front door closed, until the sound of her car faded down the street. And only then did I stand, my movements still unhurried, still calm, because nothing about what I was about to do required urgency. It required precision, and I walked to the study, closing the doors softly behind me, not to hide, but to contain the moment, to give it the quiet it deserved. And I returned to Harold's desk, opening the drawer where I had found the folder the day before, and I took it out again, placing it carefully in front of me. And this time I did not hesitate. I read through each page again, slower, more deliberately, noting the names, the clauses, the conditions that had been written with a level of foresight I had not fully appreciated until now. And I reached for the small address book Harold had kept in the back of the drawer, its pages worn at the edges, names written in ink that had faded slightly over time, and I flipped through it until I found the one I was looking for, a name I had not needed in years, but one that had never been removed, never crossed out, because Harold had believed in keeping certain connections intact, even when they were not immediately necessary. And I dialed the number slowly, listening to the steady tone as it rang, and when the voice answered on the other end, familiar despite the years that had passed, I spoke clearly, calmly. "This is Eleanor Hayes," I said. "I believe you handled some of Harold's arrangements before he passed." And there was a brief pause, just long enough for recognition to settle, and then the tone shifted, professional, attentive. "Yes, Mrs. Hayes, of course. How can I assist you?" And I explained only what was necessary, not everything, not the full picture, just enough to open the door, to re-establish a line that had been placed there for a reason. And as I listened to the response, measured, careful, I felt that same quiet certainty return, the same steady understanding that had guided me through every moment since Michael first spoke those words. And when the call ended, I did not rush to act. I did not make additional calls. I simply placed the phone back in its cradle and sat for a moment, letting the silence settle around me again, because action without patience often reveals more than it should, and I had no intention of revealing anything prematurely. And later that afternoon, when Michael returned home, he found me exactly where he expected me to be, sitting in the living room, a book open in my hands, the same calm expression on my face. And he asked how my day had been, and I answered simply, "Quiet." Because that was true. It had been quiet, but not in the way he believed. And as he moved through the house, comfortable in his assumption that everything remained under his control, I watched him with the same steady attention I had maintained all week, noting the ease in his movements, the absence of doubt in his posture, and I understood that they were both operating within a structure they believed was complete, a system they thought they had fully secured, and I allowed that belief to remain undisturbed, because the strength of what Harold had left me did not lie in immediate correction. It lay in timing, in knowing when to let something continue long enough for it to fully reveal itself. And as the evening settled into its usual rhythm, the quiet hum of conversation, the soft clink of dishes, the familiar sounds of a household moving through its routine, I remained exactly where they expected me to be, because sometimes the most effective way to take back control is not to reach for it immediately, but to wait until the moment when no one is guarding it at all. By the next few days, I understood that what they trusted most was not the paperwork, not the structure they believed they had secured, but the version of me they had created in their minds, the quiet, aging woman who would not question, who would not notice, who would simply exist within the boundaries they had drawn for her. And that realization gave me something far more valuable than any document ever could. It gave me freedom, because when people stop watching you, they stop preparing for you. And I moved through the house exactly as expected, slow, calm, predictable, leaving just enough space for them to believe their assumptions were correct, and I began to make small adjustments of my own, ones that did not disrupt their pattern, but quietly shifted the foundation beneath it. And it started with something as simple as timing. I learned when Michael checked his emails, when Sophia made her calls, when the house fell into that mid-afternoon silence where no one expected anything to change. And it was during one of those quiet windows that I returned to the study again, closing the door behind me with the same careful motion, not to conceal, but to contain, and I sat at Harold's desk once more, the folder open in front of me, the weight of it no longer unfamiliar, and I began to make notes, not on the documents themselves, but in a small notebook I had taken from the drawer, writing down dates, amounts, names, the patterns I had observed over the past week. Because clarity is built on detail, and detail requires attention, and I allowed myself the time to connect what I had seen with what I now understood, the transfers, the consolidations, the quiet redirection of control, all of it fitting into a structure that appeared complete from the outside, but held weaknesses beneath the surface. And once I had finished, I closed the notebook and returned everything to its place exactly as I had found it, because consistency is what keeps suspicion away. And later that evening, I made a different kind of adjustment, one that required no documents at all, only conversation. And as Michael sat across from me, reviewing something on his phone, I spoke in the same calm tone I had used before. "I was thinking about the house," I said, and he looked up, his attention immediate, because the house was something he now believed fell entirely within his responsibility. "What about it?" he asked, and I let a small pause settle between us, just long enough to make the thought feel uncertain. "It just feels like a lot to manage," I continued, echoing the language he had used with me days earlier, and I watched as something shifted in his expression, not suspicion, but confirmation, because he recognized his own words reflected back to him, and that recognition reinforced his belief that I was aligning with the version of reality he had created. "That is exactly why we are organizing everything," he said, his voice reassuring, confident, and I nodded slowly, as if comforted by his explanation, and Sophia, seated beside him, offered a small approving smile, her eyes briefly meeting his in silent agreement. And I realized then how easily people accept what mirrors their expectations, how quickly they relax when they believe they are understood. And over the next 2 days, I continued in the same way, asking small, careful questions that revealed more than they realized, confirming details they thought were already settled, and each answer added another piece to the picture, another layer of understanding that they did not know I was building. And at the same time, I allowed myself to appear slightly more uncertain in small, controlled ways, not enough to raise concern, but enough to reinforce the narrative they had already accepted, forgetting where I had placed my reading glasses once, asking Michael to repeat a date I had already written down, small things, harmless things, the kind that made them more comfortable, not less, because it confirmed what they believed, and comfort leads to carelessness, and carelessness reveals everything. And by the end of the week, the pattern was no longer something I needed to interpret. It was something I could predict, and prediction is what turns observation into control. And as I sat in the living room that evening, the quiet hum of the house surrounding me, I allowed myself a single, steady thought, not of anger, not of betrayal, but of timing, because everything was now in place, not just what they had arranged, but what I had quietly prepared beneath it. And the difference between those two things would only become clear when the moment arrived, a moment I was now ready to choose. The moment arrived more quietly than I expected, not with confrontation, not with raised voices or sudden revelations, but with a phone call that Michael did not anticipate. And it happened on a Monday morning when the house was still, when routine had settled into its predictable rhythm, and I was seated at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had already gone lukewarm, listening to the faint ticking of the clock as if it were marking something more significant than time. And Michael walked in, adjusting his sleeve, already focused on the day ahead, his movements efficient, controlled, exactly as they had been for weeks, and his phone rang just as he reached for his keys, a sharp, clear sound that cut through the quiet in a way that made him pause, and I watched him from across the table as he glanced at the screen, his expression shifting slightly, not alarmed, but attentive, because the number was not one he recognized. And he answered it with that same professional tone he used in business, steady, confident. "This is Michael Hayes," he said. And there was a brief silence as he listened, his posture still at first, then gradually less certain, his shoulders tightening just enough to reveal that the conversation was not unfolding in the way he expected. And I did not move. I did not speak. I simply watched, because this was not my moment to interrupt. This was my moment to observe the structure begin to respond to pressure. And as the seconds passed, I noticed the small changes, the way his grip on the phone adjusted, the way his eyes flickered briefly toward me before looking away again. And then he spoke, slower now, more careful. "I am not sure I understand," he said, and I could hear the shift in his voice, not confusion, but uncertainty, the kind that appears when a system no longer behaves as expected. And he listened again, longer this time, his expression tightening further, and when he finally responded, his words were more deliberate, more measured. "Yes, I signed documents with her, everything was authorized." And there was another pause, longer than before, and I saw it then, the first real crack, not in his actions, but in his confidence, the subtle realization that something had not aligned the way he believed it would. And he ended the call a moment later, lowering the phone slowly, his movements no longer as fluid as they had been, and for a brief moment, the room was completely silent, the kind of silence that follows when something has shifted but has not yet been acknowledged. And he looked at me then, directly, searching, not for confirmation, but for explanation, and I met his gaze calmly, my expression unchanged, because nothing about this required urgency. Nothing about this required reaction. And he spoke after a moment, his voice controlled but no longer entirely certain. "There seems to be an issue with one of the transfers," he said, and I inclined my head slightly, as if hearing this for the first time, allowing him to continue. "They are saying there are additional conditions that need to be reviewed before anything can be finalized." And I nodded slowly, my hands resting calmly in my lap, because I already knew what those conditions were. I had read them, understood them, prepared for them. And he ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I had not seen from him in years, not since he was much younger, when uncertainty still showed itself without restraint. And Sophia entered the room just then, drawn by the change in atmosphere, her eyes moving quickly between us, reading the tension in the air, and Michael turned to her, explaining the situation in brief, controlled sentences, but I could see the shift in her expression as well. The way her composure held, but tightened slightly at the edges, because this was not part of their plan, this was not part of the structure they believed they had secured, and she asked a question, quiet, precise. "What conditions?" And Michael hesitated, just for a moment, before answering. They did not specify. They just said everything needs to be reviewed. Again, and I remained where I was, still, composed, allowing the weight of that uncertainty to settle between them. Because this was the moment where belief begins to fracture, where confidence gives way to questions, and I watched as they exchanged a glance, brief but telling, the kind of look that passes between people when something they assume to be certain no longer is. And I rose from my seat slowly, not to intervene, not to explain, but simply to move through the space as I always had. And as I passed by them, I spoke in the same calm tone I had used from the beginning. "It is always good to review things carefully," I said, and I continued on without waiting for a response, because the meaning of that sentence would take time to fully settle. And as I walked down the hallway, I could feel it behind me, not fear, not panic, but the first real presence of doubt. And doubt, once introduced, has a way of expanding on its own, and I understood then that everything was unfolding exactly as it should, not because I had forced it, but because I had allowed it to reach the point where it could no longer sustain itself without question. And that was always the moment when control begins to return, not loudly, not suddenly, but quietly, steadily, in ways that cannot be easily undone. The next day did not begin with urgency. It began with quiet, the same steady rhythm that had carried through every morning before it. And I moved through the house as I always had, preparing coffee, setting my cup on the table, allowing the stillness to settle around me. Because the difference now was not in the routine, it was in what existed beneath it, the awareness that something had shifted, not just for me, but for them. And I could feel it in the way Michael entered the room, his steps. Slower, less certain, his attention divided in a way it had not been before, and he greeted me, but his voice lacked the easy confidence it once carried, replaced now with something more cautious, more measured, and Sophia followed shortly after, her expression composed as always. But there was a tension there, subtle but unmistakable, the kind that appears when control begins to feel less secure than it once did. And they sat across from me, not speaking at first, as if waiting for something to resolve itself, as if silence might somehow restore the certainty they had lost, and I allowed that silence to remain, because silence has a way of revealing more than words ever could. And after a moment, Michael spoke, his voice steady but careful. "We need to go over a few things," he said, and I looked at him calmly, offering a small nod, inviting him to continue without resistance. And he placed a folder on the table, one I recognized immediately, not because of its appearance, but because of what it represented, and he opened it, flipping through the pages with a precision that felt practiced, but not entirely confident. And Sophia leaned slightly closer, her eyes scanning the documents as if searching for something they had overlooked, and I watched them both, not with judgment, not with anger, but with a quiet clarity that had been building steadily from the moment this began. And Michael exhaled softly, before speaking again. "There are additional conditions attached to the transfers," he said, and I inclined my head slightly, as if hearing this for the first time, allowing him to explain in his own words, "Certain approvals that need to be confirmed directly," he continued, and there was a pause, a brief hesitation before he added, "From you." And I let that settle between us, the weight of that single word shifting the balance of the room in a way neither of them had anticipated. And Sophia spoke then, her voice smooth but tighter than before. "We just need to make sure everything is aligned properly," she said, and I met her gaze, steady, composed, and for the first time, I did not offer immediate agreement. I simply looked at her, allowing the moment to extend just long enough for the absence of my usual response to be noticed, and then I spoke, my voice calm, even unchanged. "I think that is a good idea," I said, and I reached for the folder, drawing it toward me with a deliberate motion, and I opened it slowly, not because I needed time to understand, but because I wanted them to see that understanding was already there, that it had been there all along. And I turned a few pages, pausing briefly at sections I had already read, already considered, already prepared for, and then I closed the folder gently, placing my hand on top of it, grounding the moment in something steady, something undeniable. And I looked at Michael, not as a mother questioning her son, but as someone who had finally stepped fully into the position they believed she had lost, and I spoke clearly, without hesitation. "Nothing moves forward without my direct authorization," I said, and there was no need to raise my voice, no need to emphasize the words, because their meaning was already clear, already understood, and I saw it then. Not shock, not anger, but realization, the quiet recognition that something fundamental had been misjudged, that the structure they had built was not as complete as they believed. And Michael sat back slightly, his expression shifting as he processed what this meant, and Sophia remained still, her composure intact, but her eyes sharper now, more focused, as if recalculating in real time. And I continued, not to explain, not to justify, but simply to state what had always been true. "Your father made sure of that," I added, and I let the sentence settle, not as a defense, but as a fact, something that existed independent of their expectations. And the room fell quiet again. But this time the silence was different. It was no longer empty. It was full, filled with the weight of understanding that had finally surfaced. And I rose from my seat slowly, smoothing my hands over the table as I stood, the same measured movement I had carried through every moment of this. And I left the folder where it was, because it no longer belonged to them in the way they thought it did. And as I turned to leave the room, I paused just briefly, not to look back, not to confirm their reactions, but to allow one final thought to settle into place, clear and steady, before I continued on, because I had never been confused, not for a single moment. I had simply been watching, waiting, and now I was done waiting.